Greetings, friend. This past week we studied the Living and Growing in the Gospel course, and we studied together through 1 Corinthians 1. So let's summarize what we learned in that chapter. So the chapter starts with a declaration of who the Corinthians were in Christ, and Paul's thankfulness for their gifting and an assurance that God would keep them blameless to the end because of his faithfulness. And Paul then addressed the first problem of the Corinthians. As you know, the Corinthians church was filled with problems, and Paul now addresses this first problem, which was divisions over leaders. And he ran right to the cross to address this issue when he asked, "Was Paul crucified for you?" His point was that we don't want to separate into groups by following specific people. Instead, believers unite under the cross. The cross is where we gather to worship the Lamb that was slain, the Lamb that takes away the sin of the world. We gather to worship in one voice. Pastor Eric Makaitis put it this way: how can a lion lay down with a lamb, or a child play in the hole of a cobra's den? Only the cross can accomplish that. Yes, lambs and lions, children and cobras can live together in peace at the cross. Then Paul does an amazing thing, and I just saw this for the first time last week. He uses the Corinthians as an illustration of the cross. And he says, think of what you were when you were called. In the past, I would separate that statement from the message of the cross by saying something like this: oh yes, I was weak and lowly and miserable and despised when God called me. Yes, and I would just think about that. Oh, isn't it wonderful that God called me in such a weak, sinful, lowly state? But you see, now I understand it, that Paul was using who the Corinthians were as a word picture of the cross. So let's think of it like that. God chose the foolish things of the world. That's who I was, foolish things of the world, to shame the wise. See, just as he chose the foolishness of the God-man hanging on a cross to bring salvation to the world. And God chose the weak things of the world to shame the wise. Yeah, I was weak in my sin. Just like Jesus being beaten nearly to death and dying on a cross in weakness, and how that opened the door for you and I to God's presence. Something no strong man could ever do. God chose the lowly things, right? Just like us in our sin, lowly. He chose the lowly things, like Jesus being treated as a worm, and the despised things. I was despised in my sin. He chose the despised thing, like Jesus dying on a criminal's cross. And listen to this. The things that are not, Jesus was not a sinner, to nullify the things that are. Jesus paid our sin debt. He removed our shame. He neutralized our guilt. The things that are not, to nullify the things that are. Isn't that beautiful? As we close this summary of 1 Corinthians chapter 1, would you stand around the foot of the cross with me and consider these words from the cross by John Miles? Can anything be worth such pain? What on earth is worth this cost? For these God's spotless Lamb was slain. How greatly he must love the lost. Gethsemane's prayer, it echoes still. No other way but Calvary's hill. Oh, I love that. Question, if you want to answer it, how does the message of the cross shame the wise? I look forward to hearing from you as Abel.